Welcome, Lindsay.
Thanks.
Good to see you.
Good to see you.
We have Dr. Lindsay Varner here. And can you share where you're located and what you do?
Yeah, so I'm in Ferrisburgh, Vermont, which is in the Champlain Valley, and I am the museum director at Rokeby Museum.
And you've been there for how many months now?
Oh, I started at the end of September, so not too awful long.
Does it feel like a long time or just a short time?
It feels like a short period of time, but it's been awkward with the pandemic because typically, starting out in a new position in a new state where I haven't met any of the other people in the area, I would be out meeting people and kind of introducing myself and what my vision is for the sites, and everything's been on Zoom, and I've been in my office the entire time, but it's given me an opportunity to dig into the collections and really get to know the history of the site and the family. So I feel like I know a lot more about the site than I ever thought I would in such a short period of time.
Yeah, and you bring a strong academic background to the museum setting. If we call it a museum, a historic site. I mean, I use the word museum very loosely for a lot of those things. But can
Yeah.
you share a little bit about that background and of course you're an expert on Quaker, certain parts of Quaker history, correct?
Yeah, early Quakerism.
Yeah. So can you share a little bit about that and how you just got into it and
Yeah, sure. So I kind of took the traditional academic routes. I went undergrad and then decided I wanted to go to grad school and went to the UK to Durham University for my master's and my PhD in early modern British history. And I focused in on the Reformation and religious change and community development. And I always had this interest in how communities became engaged in religion during the Reformation period. And you have this explosion of multiple religions during the Reformation. And I was always fascinated in how people got engaged and involved. And then what would eventually become Quakerism, how religions developed, and you could really get a feel for that during the Reformation period. So I studied Quakerism in Durham and Newcastle in Northeast England. And so I was in the UK until 2015, and had, intended to take the full traditional academic route, a graduate degree, hopefully get a postdoc somewhere, teach in an academic setting, and none of that happened. Moving back, post kind of recession period, there weren't a whole lot of European academic positions in the United States. So I pivoted a little bit and went more of the community public humanities routes rather than the academic route.
what for someone like me who doesn't know anything about what's the Reformation again?
So it's the period in across Europe, but I studied a lot in the British Isles. So it's the splitting of the church from the Catholic Church. So you have the explosion of Protestant religions across Europe. So Lutheranism, Baptists, Quakers, even the Church of England is that split from the Roman Catholic Church. And so I looked very closely at the late 16th and throughout the 17th century and the early 18th century. And my real interest was Quakers, who came out of the English Civil Wars in the middle of the 17th century. And I was interested in how a religion that was so deeply focused on individual relationship with God became this community denomination that was they were really focused on breaking down hierarchy. So there were no ministers; everybody was a minister, and yet they still formed a religious organization, which kind of went against that initial understanding of Quakerism. So I was fascinated in how community played a role in that. And that idea of community has kind of followed me throughout my career, whether it's studying the past and how communities form to how communities interact today. I've kind of just continued that line with everything that I've done with my work.
Yeah. Did um did the when the Quakers made their way here to the U.S., was there a part of the faith that got swept up in the, what was it, in the 19th century? There were revivalist and expectation movements of the 19th century. Did they spin off in any way?
Yeah, they did. So there was a break in Quakerism. And actually, that's where the site that I'm at in Rokeby, where it becomes really important. You have the Hickman Split. And it's a change in the understanding of doctrine and how Quakers kind of view themselves as Quakers. And in particular, for the Robinsons who lived at Rokeby, they were devout Quakers, and they were abolitionists, and they had very strong feelings on how abolition should take place within the United States. And Quakers were some of the leading abolitionists in the United States, but they disagreed with how abolition, they basically believed in immediate emancipation of slaves. And the family split. They were devout Quakers. They were dedicated. You see them very active in the Quaker meetings in the area, but they were so committed to abolition that they split with their religious organization in order to follow what they believed in for ending slavery in the US. So they ran this site as a stop on the Underground Railroad, as well as being very active in the Vermont Anti-Slavery Society and the anti-slavery societies across the US. They were close with William Lloyd Garrison, who was the editor of The Liberator. They were writing to people all over the country, really pushing for abolition.
Is that a story that you've been tasked with, or maybe you've tasked yourself with trying to elaborate on that story more at Rokeby, or have they been doing that pretty well? Or
yeah, I think one of the things that really drew me to Rokeby is I think the museum was in many ways ahead of their time with the education center that they built. They put in a permanent exhibit on the second floor of the Ed Center that is entitled Free and Safe. And it would have been really easy, I think, for a museum to focus on, this white Quaker abolition history, to this family who were working on the Underground Railroad and were writing, and they had a library that was being sent around to try and convince people that abolition was the way to go. But the museum decided to focus on their story, but through the eyes of two freedom seekers who traveled to Rokeby, that we had some information on their journey from the South on the Underground Railroad to the site here, and what their experience was like on the Underground Railroad. And I think in 2013, when that exhibit opened, you wouldn't have seen that in a lot of museums. The focus was on these two previously enslaved people and their search for freedom. And then the Robinsons are kind of weaved into that story. And I think that is very unique. And that is currently the story that we continue to tell at the site.
Yeah. Yeah, because it was those enslaved peoples that were actually doing the work. I mean, they were escaping and trying to find safe passage. And I mean, not to diminish the sacrifices that some of the families made in hiding those folks, but like you said, there's a little bit different emphasis.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Rokeby is interesting because we are one of the best documented Underground Railroad sites in the country. The family saved all of their letters. So the two individuals that we can tell the story about, we know about them because there were letters going back and forth between other individuals helping on the Underground Railroad to get Simon and Jesse to Rokeby, and likely on to Canada. We don't know what happened to them after they left the site. But there's just this fantastic story of these two individuals. And once they get here, they stay for at least a short period of time. The one benefit of Vermont is if you could make it to Vermont, the reason we entitled the exhibit Free and Safe is, you don't have to hide. They were living here, but they didn't have to hide while they were here. We know that Jesse was working on the farm for a period of time, trying to save up money. But likely the ultimate goal was Canada, because once you made it to Canada, you really were safe. It's a fascinating story, and the Robinsons were just central to the movement here in Vermont.
Did it stay in their family for a while, or did their property get sold, and did other families live there with other histories?
It's been in the Robinson family since 1793. So from 1793 to 1961, we have 4 generations of the Robinson family that lived here. And the family was very aware of their legacy. They, not so much the Underground Railroad legacy, they knew about it, they talked about it, but the second generation was the generation that ran the Underground Railroad. The third generation was they had an author in the family, Rowland Evans Robinson. And Rowland wrote books on Vermont. He wrote Vermont's history. He was a naturalist and a conservationist. He was a illustrator for a short period of time, but when he lost his eyesight, he turned to writing, and he was a very famous author during his period in the 19th century. So the family really saw him as the legacy. And his children, the 4th generation, created a memorial association on his behalf, with the intent being that when the last Robinson passed away on the site, that the museum would be created. So there was always this kind of understanding of legacy, which is why we have 15,000 letters and all of these items belonging to the family. They knew that there was something important here, and they were intending to create the museum eventually.
How about structures and property in the landscape there? I imagine if it stayed in the family for so long, some of that is still intact.
Yeah, we have 90 acres on the site as a whole. So we have the historic home, several outbuildings, and they put in trails recently. So you can go through the 90 acres and there's interpretation talking about the change in landscape. What's really interesting about the site is when it was taken over in the 1960s, and it was a farm for all through the 4 generations, but farming in Vermont overall was on the decline by the 1960s, and it wasn't really a functioning farm at that point.
Mhm.
So there was a lot of preservation work that needed to take place. A number of the outbuildings that we have been rebuilt, heavily stabilized, so that they could be used and explored as part of the site. So we can tell a whole series of stories. We have the story of some of the first merino sheep in the United States ended up, or in Vermont really, ended up in on the Robinson farm. They were one of the largest sheep farms in the state for a while. You have the abolition story. We have literature, art. One of the Robinsons was a relatively famous artist before she passed away in 1919. So we have so many stories that we can tell, from national history to local history to Vermont state history.
Yeah. One way to really try to engage the public is the idea of living history, and I mean, families love to go visit farms and feed animals and um, hike on trails, and there's something sort of bucolic about visiting an old farm and tapping into, even though it's a little bit of a phantom nostalgia of how things were. Um, has there been any momentum there at Rokeby to try to cultivate that with the communities in the area in terms of using the landscape and the property? And
Yeah, that's one of the conversations we've been starting to have. I'm One of the things that I was really eager to do when I started was to immediately jump into a strategic plan for the site. They've
Mhm.
never had one as far as institutional history. Nobody can identify a strategic plan at any point. And landscape use for the site and site use is one of the things that we're going to be exploring within the plan. Um, right now, there's not a whole lot of living history that's taking place. There used to be a wool festival, and that kind of just disappeared. And from what I understand, it was incredibly popular, bringing back this idea of, as you were saying, agriculture and experiencing, what it would have been like to have a sheep farm. in Vermont and shearing the sheep. And we're thinking through some new ideas for how to really utilize the site. We've got 2 open fields that we're not doing anything with. And when you look out at them, it'd be wonderful if you could have somebody farming those. Currently, they just go to hay and the neighbor mows it. But really trying to think through how we can connect to the community and how they want to use the site, and trying to draw people in, whether it's on the trails or to the museum or to the historic home, or even to some of our programming that's focusing on social justice and racial justice, and tying it back into the second generation's drive for abolition, and really speaking power to truth and what they believed in, and how that ties into conversations that are happening today. So we're currently going through essentially and asking the public, what would they like to see on the site? And is it living history? Is it having the site used for farming? Do we put in a kitchen garden and let the community come and use it as a community garden? I think there's lots of potential for the site, and for the community to utilize it a little bit more.
I think is it Connor Prairie in Indiana that does a sort of a action-based tour where you're in the shoes of someone trying to gain freedom, and they have the acreage available for you to these young people are literally running through the woods, and they simulate the best that they can in a way that's respectful of the history, to try to give people a sense of the danger and the fear but the anticipation and all of the emotions. And from what I can remember, they do it the right way. It doesn't come across as whatever. But so you mentioned that there's trails.
Yeah, we have a couple of miles of trails on the site. One of the trails is interpreted and kind of points out some of the agriculture on the site. And the other trail walks you through the portion of the property that was reclaimed by woodland. About 80% of Vermont was clear cut at one point to accommodate sheep. And the one portion of our property has been reclaimed. The family did plant a lot of trees. So the interpretive trail talks a little bit about that.
When we are using the word communities, is there a town nearby, or is a series of little towns a city?
Yeah, we're kind of in between a couple of towns. So we're on Route 7, which is a major route running through this portion of Vermont. Burlington's about 35 minutes away. And then we have a series of small towns. The smallest city in Vermont's about 10 minutes away, Virgins. So that's our closest main town. And then Ferrisburgh is where we're located. And there's a small center in Ferrisburgh that has its own historic site that they're working on. They have a church there. It was the site of the Great Convention. So we have ties to that. The Great Convention was part of Frederick Douglass's New England tour. So he visited and gave a speech when he was quite young, in his late 20s. And that it's where they had a whole anti-slavery convention. So we've got small towns along the way. We're also very close to Shelburne and the Shelburne Museum. Yeah. So there's a lot of tourism going towards Shelburne, and we get quite a few people who come for the weekend to go to Shelburne and learn about Rokeby and come and visit us as well.
Are there any places to stay on site, like guest cabins or anything like that?
No, and it's funny because that was one of the things that we were talking about in terms of site use, because as agriculture declined, the family actually turned to tourism. And in the early 20th century, Vermont as a state really pushed tourism, and which is why we have so many tourists here today. So getting people here during tree tapping season for maple, and during leaf season, and getting people here for skiing. So we have a tourist cabin on site that the family built to house some of these tourists. And then they also kept them in the house in some of the rooms.
Hmm.
So we've talked about, how do we tap into that story a little bit more? Because we have tons and tons of signs that they used to just plaster on the main street, letting people know that they could stay at the house while they were here visiting.
Ah, they could come stay and cross-country ski.
Yeah, we've been very busy this winter, cross-country skiers on the trails and
Okay.
snowshoeing. Yeah.
I was thinking about that the other day because we had a snowstorm here in Pennsylvania, and I thought, well, where could I just go cross-country skiing? It's not like you can just go anywhere. Or, I mean, you need a big property to do it.
Hmm.
Otherwise, you're weaving in and out of public property and streets and
Going around in circles and yeah.
yeah. Yeah. So with that amount of acreage, I imagine someone could go. It's a pretty nice trail they could go on for a while.
Yeah, and I've been really pushing the trails for people to come and visit. The local library is doing a snowshoe lending library. So
Hmm.
we gave them some of our maps. So if people would go and get a pair of snowshoes, they could come out and walk the trail as well.
Snowshoe Lending Library. That is cool.
Isn't that amazing?
People just walk in them and get exercise.
Hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah, they come in handy here.
Is it because there's just so many inches of snow or?
Yeah, it just continuously piles up. We haven't had a major snow this winter, but we've had lots of little snows and it doesn't melt. So it just starts to add up. And the snowshoes really help to keep you from sinking down too far. So they come in handy. When I go for a run, I snowshoe part of the way on my run until I hit the road. And then I dump my snowshoes on the side of a tree and then go for a run.
But does do they have a humanities group there? Kind of like, I'm familiar with your work in Pennsylvania with
Mhm.
PA Humanities. Is there a similar humanities
Yeah,
organization there?
there's the Vermont Humanities Council.
Okay. And you're have you been there long enough to kind of get cued into what they're doing, the work that they're doing, or?
Yeah, I've met with the director and chatted with them, and I talked to him about some of the work I was doing in Pennsylvania. And I think there's this general push in the humanities field towards this more kind of public humanities and action-based humanities programming. And so I had a really nice chat with their director about, how can we make some of the work that we're doing a little bit more community centered and action based. And Rokeby through the past few years has really been more community focused on not just holding a lecture, but trying to create some meaningful impact in the community, whether it's through education or workshops. And the Humanities Council seems to want to make that kind of push as well. So we had some really great conversations about how to bring some of the ideas and the programming that we were doing in Pennsylvania, and how can we make use of it at Rokeby a little bit more.
Yeah. Yep. And where do you know where they're headquartered?
Montpelier.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, so that's about hour and a half or so from here.
Hmm. Do people just drive whenever they don't get scared with little flurries here and there, do they?
No, not at all. They're very good at getting roads cleared. I'll wake up in the morning and you can hear the plows going about 6 a.m. And think I've only had 2 days where the weather's been kind of iffy and I haven't come into the office, but I just work from home. And that's mostly because we don't plow our drive until we get 3 to 4 inches of snow at the office.
Yeah. Did the families over the year Robinson, right?
Yeah.
Did the families ever have farm hands or anything like that, African American or other workers on the farm?
They did, yeah. So we know that,
My follow-up was, are there any of their children's children around?
yeah, so we we don't know a whole lot about Simon and Jesse once they left. We
Oh,
know that they stayed and they worked on the farm while they were here. And then afterwards, their stories just kind of disappear. And what I find really interesting is we don't even know what their surname was. We know their first names, and that's it. And that's mostly because of the letters that were sent to get them to Rokeby. And we know Jesse stayed because he wanted to negotiate his freedom with his owner in North Carolina. So he was illiterate, so he asked the Robinsons to write on his behalf to his owner to negotiate what the price would be to buy his freedom. And so we have the whole series of letters going back and forth between the Robinsons and the Elliott family. So we know that Jesse was staying here and working during that time. But we don't know a whole lot about the people who are here. We know that there were a couple of African Americans that were employed by the family. You have Mingo Niles, and there were a couple of people who were here working on the farm and also working in the house. And I think what complicates the history and is a conversation that we want to be having in the community is you have Roland and Rachel Robinson, who are these ardent abolitionists, and then you have their children who are not. And our museum actually has a quote from one of the letters from their son George. It's essentially just this racist rant about the African Americans who are working in his parents' home. And so you have this very complicated history within the family that the museum has never shied away from telling, because it's part of that national story. That he very much fell into kind of 19th century cultural norms, post Civil War, going into Reconstruction and afterwards. And he was constantly just kind of he was just constantly saying terrible things about the people who were working here. But it's something that echoes within the national story as well. So we try and we don't want the Robinsons to be put on this pedestal. We really want people to understand that they were part of a much bigger history, and we should be talking about that.
Yeah, it seems like as you read the histories of a lot of different places in the U.S., when I went to school, it was always sort of like the North and the South, and
Yeah.
But within families in all those different states, there was a lot of separation and disunity on what to. And like when I was in Tennessee, parts of Tennessee where Knoxville was different with other parts, and there were a lot of abolitionists in Tennessee that their stories just hadn't come out or whatever. But families, you hear a lot of times where families with the generations, especially, would just split over these issues.
Yeah, it's so much more complicated than North good, South bad, which is what was taught for so many years, and is still taught in many places. That the North was free and the South had people enslaved, and there was no nuance and complexity talked about within the history. And I think slowly we're starting to see more cultural institutions start to address that within their interpretation. And as more of these stories come out, they're being incorporated into that history. I think with Mount Tabor in Pennsylvania and the work that we've been doing there, the whole idea that there was an African American community in this tiny little town of 2,000 people in central Pennsylvania, and nobody bothered to record their history or to recognize that there was this significant historic site in their town, or even a segregated cemetery that was being cared for by two elderly ladies. Those types of stories, as they come out, I think there's an awareness that things need to change and these stories need to be talked about and put into the classrooms and incorporated into this wider narrative, because we can't keep going on and saying, that, everybody in the North was good and they didn't believe in slavery, because we know that's not true. And that community exists because of segregation and because their history wasn't deemed worthy of recording. And I think coming to terms with that is very important.
sometimes I'll have people ask me, well, what can history do to to maybe address isn't the right word, but what can history do to help um, shed light on the issues that we're facing as a society now? And I think sometimes it comes down to, deep down, people just want their stories to be known. They want to be able to share those stories, and they don't want them hidden anymore. Or and through that process of being openly be able to share their stories, there's healing that takes place, and there's more understanding. And sometimes um, that's really powerful. I mean, it can be just as powerful as trying to change a piece of legislation or something like that, or some of the other things that people are working toward. um, but if the stories don't come out and people don't feel like they can share them for whatever reason, um, then it really hinders the healing that can take place. Um, so it's so cool that you have landed at a place that has this Quaker history, and some years ago, that's what you were studying.
Yeah, and I can't get away from Quakers. It all comes back around.
Yeah.
I think when I saw the job description for Rokeby and I showed it to my husband, he said, it's like you wrote your own job description. He's like, this is exactly what I would expect for you. They're Quakers, it's Underground Railroad. They're talking about, the history of social justice, and then focusing on social justice today and how history can inform the conversations happening. He's like, it's everything you love. It's perfect, Lindsay. So, and it really has been since I started. It's been such a wonderful combination of research interests from way back when I was doing lots of academic research, to working directly with the community and with schools and other institutions and organizations in the area, and getting to do a lot of great outreach for the site, which is what I love to do. I love to talk about places that I'm passionate about. And I love Rokeby. It's a place that really does inspire people to want to learn more about history.
Are there any colleges or universities nearby that where students are at that level are getting engaged?
Yeah, we have Middlebury College, which is just probably 20 minutes south of us, and then the University of Vermont. We work a lot with Middlebury College. They actually hold our collection of letters. They're on permanent loan in their archives, which is wonderful because it means the students get to engage with them more readily than they would if we held them here at the museum. And Middlebury's also started to do a crowdsourced transcriptions service. So 300 of our letters are currently online, and people can read through them and transcribe them, and students are getting engaged with the project. So it's a wonderful partnership to have. And they've got a lot of professors that want to work with Rokeby because they know the importance of the history here and the resources that we have. So we have a great relationship with that college.
If someone's listening or viewing and they're not familiar with transcription and how that works, can you, that project, like, what is like the brass tacks, like what does that mean? There's these documents that are older, and then what's happening with them?
Yeah, so some of our letters have been scanned and they've been put into a program where basically you can read the letter, the original handwriting, it's the original letter, and you basically read through it and type it up for us.
Okay.
And then it makes it more readily available to teachers, to students. It's terrible to say, but I've met a lot of students today that can't read cursive, and all of these letters are in cursive. And it just adds to the level of inaccessibility. If somebody sees this letter and can't read it, they're going to move on. So by having somebody type up all of these letters, it allows people to utilize them more easily.
So if it's typed up and then it's in kind of a database or it's in a format that someone could search. Now that
Mhm.
it's typed, if I were to search for sheep or whatever, it will allow me to find where every place where a sheep is used.
Yep. So it makes it searchable. It makes it a little bit more accessible for use in education, for research. So yeah, we've got 300 of them currently on the website. We've got thousands of more to go.
Um, yeah, it's there's just so many documents out there that um, well, that's happening too in public history museums, is that the information is um, changing because we're, as time goes on, more and more information gets out there about different subjects, right? And
Yeah.
peoples, and because I was thinking about, you're saying north is bad and south is, good, and a lot of that maybe came from historians that back in the day that, they were looking at, it was a bird's eye view of what, the Civil War and after the Civil War. But maybe as more documents come to light and they're transcribed and searchable, all these other little histories are more apparent.
Yeah, and I think by having things better accessible through the digitization process and getting them online and easily available to people, those stories are coming to light and they're no longer it's no longer just an academic pursuit to find a lot of these stories. I think there was a big kind of shift in academia in the mid 20th century towards looking at history from the bottom up. But it was still very much within academia because they had the time to go to the archive and discover these stories and
Yeah, I'm
spend
the
months.
doctor, professor. I'm going to look at it at the bottom.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. But now that it's more readily available and people are doing their own genealogy and you can go to Ancestry and find all these stories of your family members and all these stories are coming forward and it's a lot easier to tell them and they're getting out into the community more and more readily and it's not through an academic journal or a book that's very difficult for the average person to read. It's through interpretation and storytelling and oral histories. And I think we're just going to start to see our history changing so much because we're learning more and more than we ever have been.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, before the lightning round, is there anything that you want to plug anywhere, any project that you're working on? It could be, could be there before we have the lightning round.
Yeah, I would be remiss if I didn't put a plug in for Mount Tabor because I know that Mount Tabor is probably going to listen to your podcast and they were recently put onto the National Historic Register last week.
Mhm.
A week ago today, actually, we got the news that this incredible little site was put onto the National Register, and that site has it changed so much of how I view public history. I think I came to public history and applied history, whichever term you want to use for it, from that kind of academic point of view. I was working in public history while doing a PhD with the intent that I would just go straight into academia. And so I came into it with a very kind of research oriented mindset. And I studied community, but I don't think I really understood community and personal relationships with history
Mm.
until I started working on the project with Mount Tabor. Um, I mean, the entire story of the church coming from a storytelling project that I was working on, the Community Heart and Soul, and that one story from a family member with ties to the African American community in Mount Tabor Church, and how that one story could lead to the creation of a nonprofit and a local government taking ownership not just of the site but of their very complicated and racist past and wanting to push forward to create a site that honored a community that was pretty much just written out of history has really impacted how I view community work and just how important it is to talk with people to recognize that their story matters and that it is a part of our community history. It has impacted me in a way that I did not think was possible. And I hope that anybody working in the field, I hope everybody has their version of Mount Tabor, because it's just meant so much to me. And then the people that I've met through it, I never would have guessed that many congregants and descendants were still around. But I remember one person saying that they just didn't know what to do, and they were afraid to say anything because they just didn't think anybody cared.
Mm.
And that hit me so hard, that idea of thinking that nobody cares about your history. And that's just kind of stayed with me, because I don't want anybody to ever feel like their history doesn't matter.
Right. Well, we've got to have them on. You got to help me get them on and share their story, because
Oh,
I
I
think,
think we can make that happen.
yeah. All right, you ready for the lightning round?
All right, yes, let's do this.
Okay, I've got these are hard questions. You better go back in your PhD dissertation and all right. So, would you rather be four-wheeling or fishing?
Ooh, that's tough. I think right now I'd rather be four-wheeling.
Right now, yeah.
Yeah, I'm not an ice fisherman.
All right. You're about to. They have a term for this. I read about it. The poor subscription based television companies. There's a term for viewers that'll sign up for 3 months and then they stop because they go on to another. Like, so you have to choose. You have to drop one: HBO or Disney Channel.
Ooh, HBO.
You would drop HBO?
Probably. I don't know. Right now, I'm enjoying the Marvel part of Disney, so I'm gonna go with HBO.
And finally, venison or pulled pork?
Oh, venison, hands down.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. It's just, yeah, pulled pork has to be done by like a master, pit person. It's been doing it for 100 years for it to really be like the way that I like it.
Yeah, it's you can get it wrong very easily, but you can do the same with venison. But I grew up with venison, so I know good venison and how to not overdo it. And my husband is becoming a very good cook with venison. So I'd have to pick that over pork any day.
Are there deer on site at Rokeby?
Oh, there's all manners of animals at Rokeby. But we do have deer, yes.
Probably some in attics you don't want.
There are lots of squirrels. There's a woodpecker who is my nemesis that
Oh,
I am not a fan of. On Thanksgiving morning, we came out and ran the trails, and there was a bobcat on the trails carrying
wow.
a squirrel in his mouth. So I was pretty happy. We can get rid of some squirrels here. Um, but yeah, I've heard lots of stories from staff about a black bear that's roamed through, and coyotes. And yeah, there's lots of fun wildlife stories.
Yeah.
The joy of being in New England and on 90 acres, there's always something.
Yeah. Well, this has been a lot of fun.
Yeah, thanks so much. This has been great.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'll be in touch with you soon about the getting Mount Tabor to come on and share their story.
Absolutely. I know they would love it. And it's an incredible story.
Yeah. Okay, Lindsay, thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.